Bleak, oppressive, and increasingly horrifying, Episode 1 of Chernobyl begins on April 26, 1988, exactly 2 years after the explosion of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Inside his dimly lit apartment, Soviet scientist Valery Legasov records a series of tapes detailing what happened at Chernobyl. He speaks about the cost of lies and questions what remains when the truth has been buried so much that nobody can distinguish it from fiction. After finishing his recording, Legasov wraps the tapes and leaves his apartment. A nearby car hints that he's being watched, forcing Legasov to cautiously hide the recording outside. Legasov then feeds his cat, smokes one final cigarette, and checks the time. When the clock reaches 1:23 AM, he hangs himself. The episode then takes us back exactly 2 years and 1 minute, returning to the moment when the catastrophe began. On April 26, 1986, Lyudmila Ignatenko is awakened by a deep rumbling outside her apartment in Pripyat. Her husband is a firefighter called Vasily Ignatenko, and he joins her at the window as an enormous explosion tears through Reactor 4 of the nearby Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Inside the plant, however, it's complete chaos. Alarms are screaming out, and workers are desperately trying to determine the condition of the reactor. Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov immediately assumes that one of the control system tanks has exploded. When the workers report that the reactor itself may have been destroyed, Dyatlov refuses to believe this. Alexander Akimov insists that they all follow the correct procedure and press the emergency shutdown button, but Dyatlov dismisses his concerns. He orders Akimov and Leonid Toptunov to begin pumping water into the reactor, believing that the core merely needs to be cooled. Of course, that's easier said than done when there actually isn't a functioning reactor left to cool. Elsewhere inside the plant, workers begin searching for their missing colleagues. The corridors are filled with smoke, while several men are already showing signs of severe radiation exposure. Viktor Proskurikov and Alexander Kudryavtsev are ordered to enter the reactor hall and manually lower the control rods. Despite realizing how dangerous this could be, the men obey. When they finally reach the reactor hall, they discover that the core is completely exposed. There's no roof, no functioning reactor, and no possibility of manually lowering anything. The men stare directly into the burning remains of Reactor 4, receiving a lethal dose of radiation for their efforts. Even when they return and report what they've seen, Dyatlov refuses to accept it. He accuses them of being mistaken and continues ordering water to be pumped into the ruins. Now, firefighters from Pripyat are called to the plant, but they're given almost no information about the danger awaiting them. Vasily joins the crews heading towards Reactor 4, but none of the firefighters are wearing protective equipment to shield them from radiation. Among the rubble outside are chunks of graphite thrown from the reactor core, providing unmistakable proof now that Reactor 4 has been torn open. One man picks up a piece of graphite before quickly dropping it again. Within moments, his hand begins to burn. Another firefighter feels a strange metallic taste in his mouth, but the crews continue working all the same. As the injured firefighters are transported to hospital, the medical staff are completely unprepared as they have no iodine tablets to combat radiation. Meanwhile, the firefighters' contaminated clothing is discarded in the hospital basement, where it remains dangerously radioactive. While the firefighters risk their lives above ground, Chernobyl senior officials gather inside a secure bunker beneath the plant. Dyatlov joins plant director Viktor Brukhanov and chief engineer Nikolai Fomin, who are determined to downplay what's happened. Their dosimeters have registered radiation at 3.6 Rontgen per hour, which they claim is not great, not terrible. However, that reading is not the true radiation level, as it's the highest number their low-range equipment is capable of displaying. Now, Anatoly Sitnikov is sent to inspect the plant and reports that a reactor core is exposed. Like everyone else though, he's quickly dismissed. Now, Brukhanov and Fomin order Sitnikov to climb onto the roof and look directly into the reactor building. He knows that doing so will expose him to a fatal amount of radiation, but refusing an order here is not a realistic option. Now, Sitnikov makes the climb and confirms what the officials continue to deny. Reactor 4 is gone. Despite this, the local executive committee decides against evacuating Pripyat. One official argues that the population must be prevented from spreading panic and misinformation. So rather than warning the people, the authorities cut the telephone lines and close the roads leading out of the city. Morning arrives, so the people of Pripyat remain completely unaware of the danger surrounding them. Our families go about their daily routines and residents gather outside to look at the smoke rising from the plant. An invisible cloud of radioactive material is already drifting across the city, but nobody has been warned to remain indoors. In Moscow, Legasov receives a telephone call informing him that there has been an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear plant. He's ordered to join the government commission overseeing the response, setting up his involvement in the disaster. Back in Pripyat, a bird suddenly falls from the sky and lands dead beside them, but the children continue walking. Episode 2 of Chernobyl picks up with the horrifying aftermath of the explosion continuing to unfold. The residents of Pripyat remain unaware of the danger surrounding them, while scientists elsewhere begin to realise that something catastrophic has happened. Now, 7 hours after the explosion, nuclear physicist Ulana Khomyuk is working at the Belarusian Institute for Nuclear Energy when one of her instruments suddenly begins registering unusually high radiation levels. When Khomyuk checks the direction of the wind, she realises that the radiation is coming from further south. After making several calls, she eventually learns there has been a fire at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The official explanation here claims that the situation is under control, but the radiation readings tell a very different story. Now, meanwhile, in Moscow, Legasov is summoned before a government committee led by Boris Sherbina. The officials have been told that a control system tank exploded at Chernobyl and that the resulting fire is being managed. And Legasov explains that a graphite has been discovered outside the reactor building. As graphite is used inside the reactor core, its presence on the ground could only mean that the core itself has exploded. The other officials remain skeptical, but Legasov continues, explaining that if the core is exposed, the fire is releasing radioactive material directly into the atmosphere. Now, every second they sit here and delay will allow the contamination to spread further across the Soviet Union and into the rest of Europe. Legasov's concerns are serious enough for him to be sent to Chernobyl alongside Sherbina. Together they board a helicopter and head toward the plant to assess the situation. Now, as they approach Chernobyl, Sherbina orders the pilot to fly directly over Reactor 4. Legasov immediately shuts that idea down, warning that the radiation above the exposed core would kill them within days. Legasov points towards the debris scattered around the plant and identifies the black material as graphite. When they land, Legasov and Sherbina meet plant director Brukhanov and chief engineer Nikolai Fomin. The two men continue to insist that the reactor is intact and accuse the workers who reported seeing graphite of being confused. Now, Anatoly Dyatlov is brought into the meeting, but he is already suffering from radiation sickness and can barely stand. After the senior officials show the radiation level is only 3.6, Legasov explains that the dosimeters used at the plant are only capable of measuring up to that number, meaning the true level could be considerably higher. To settle the argument, General Pikolov drives towards the reactor in a lead-lined vehicle carrying a high-range dosimeter. When he returns, his reading is approximately 15,000 Röntgen per hour. Now, Brukhanov and Fomin are immediately arrested, while Sherbina finally accepts that the Soviet Union is facing an unprecedented nuclear disaster. Legasov explains that a graphite fire must be extinguished before it releases even more radioactive material into the atmosphere. Water can't be used here, so he proposes dropping a mixture of sand and boron directly onto the reactor. The sand should work to smother the fire, while the boron will absorb the neutrons and help prevent further nuclear reactions. Now, military helicopters are brought in to make the drops, but the pilots have to fly directly toward the burning reactor, exposing themselves to intense radiation in the process. They then need to release their loads with enough accuracy to hit the exposed core. Legasov warns them not to fly directly above, but one helicopter does just that and passes too close. Its blades strike a crane cable and the aircraft spirals out of control, crashing beside the plant and killing everyone aboard. Now, back in Belarus, Khomyuk learns through coded communications what's happening at Chernobyl. The news confirms that a reactor core has been exposed and the government has been lying about the scale of the disaster. Realising that the disaster can no longer be concealed from the outside world, the Soviet Union finally acknowledges that an accident has occurred. 36 hours after the explosion, the authorities finally order an evacuation. Now, hundreds of buses enter Pripyat as an announcement instructs residents to gather their belongings and leave their homes, but only enough possessions for 3 days, given the evacuation is apparently temporary. The convoy eventually departs, leaving Pripyat completely deserted. Akomyuk arrives at the command center and urgently asks to speak with Legasov. She's been studying the reactor plans and believes the attempts to smother the fire have created another potentially catastrophic problem. Thousands of tons of sand and boron have been dropped, but the intense heat will eventually melt this material into a radioactive mass resembling lava. Beneath Reactor 4 are several bubbler pools containing millions of litres of water. The plant workers had been pumping water into the reactor throughout the night, but if the molten material reaches that water, it could trigger a massive thermal explosion. The blast would destroy the remaining reactors, spread radioactive material across a vast area, and contaminate much of Ukraine, Belarus, and the surrounding region. Legasov and Akomyuk present the threat to Sherbina and the government commission. The only way to prevent the explosion is to drain the water from the tanks beneath the reactor. Unfortunately, the valves controlling those tanks are located inside the flooded basement. The water is also heavily contaminated too, meaning whoever enters will be exposed to an enormous amount of radiation. Even with the right equipment, the mission is likely to be fatal. So Sherbina gathers the plant workers and asks for volunteers, and eventually 3 men volunteer. Alexei, Ananenko, Valery Bezbalov, and Boris Buranov. They know the layout of the plant, and after putting on wetsuits, masks and protective clothing, descend into the flooded basement. Their dosimeters crackle constantly, and as they wade further into the radioactive water, their lights begin to fail. One by one, the torches flicker out, leaving the 3 men stranded in complete darkness. Episode 3 of Chernobyl returns with the workers continuing to try and prevent an even greater catastrophe beneath Reactor 4. As the 3 divers continue searching through the flooded basement, and with failed flashlights, they're left swallowed by darkness and dangerously radioactive water. Thankfully, the lights flicker back on and the men eventually locate the valves. They successfully drain the bubbler pools, preventing the molten reactor material from reaching the water below. And meanwhile, Legasov explains that the nuclear fuel inside Reactor 4 is still melting through the concrete foundations. If it reaches the groundwater, it could contaminate the drinking supply used by millions of people. The only solution here is to install a heat exchanger beneath the reactor. This means digging a tunnel underneath the plant and creating a chamber that can be filled with liquid nitrogen. The Minister of Coal, Mikhail Shardov, is sent to recruit workers for the job, and he immediately stands out, dressed in a spotless suit and flanked by armed soldiers either side of him. He arrives at a mine in Tula and asks the men to undertake an important assignment. The miners aren't stupid and quickly work out that it involves Chernobyl. Despite the danger, Glukov agrees to help. Before leaving, the miners surround Shardov and pat his face and suit with their coal-covered hands, leaving him coated in black dust. And once they arrive in Chernobyl, Legasov explains that they need a 150-meter tunnel dug beneath Reactor 4. Glukov studies the plans and tells them he will need 400 men to complete the work in time. Sherbina agrees and the miners immediately get started. Elsewhere, Ulana Akomyuk arrives at Moscow Hospital No. 6 to interview the surviving plant workers. She's determined to understand exactly what happened inside Reactor 4 and why the emergency shutdown failed. Dyatlov is among those receiving treatment here, and although his condition is deteriorating, he continues to deny any responsibility. Meanwhile, Lyudmila Ignatenko arrives at a hospital searching for her husband. She's warned that Vasily has been exposed to radiation and she must remain behind a protective screen. She also can't touch him either. When Lyudmila enters the room though, Vasily appears far healthier than expected. Relieved to see him, Lyudmila ignores the warning and embraces him. However, Vasily's improvement is only temporary here. The firefighters have entered the latency period of radiation sickness, where symptoms briefly subside before their conditions rapidly worsen. Now back at Chernobyl, the miners begin digging beneath the reactor. The conditions inside the tunnel are pretty unbearable, given the air is thick with dust and the temperature continues to rise, making it increasingly difficult for the men to work. Glukov asks for fans to be installed, but Legasov refuses. You see, ventilation would actually pull radioactive dust inside from the surface, exposing the miners to even greater contamination. Rather than stop working, the miners simply remove all their clothes and continue digging naked. During the walk outside, Sherbina asks Legasov about the effects of radiation. He's developed a persistent cough and worries that he may already be dying. Legasov explains that radiation affects people differently depending on the dose. A smaller exposure may lead to cancer years later, while a more severe dose begins destroying the body almost immediately. With time of the essence, Legasov struggles to give Sherbina a definite answer over how long he has. Now at the hospital, Khomyuk interviews Alexander Akimov. His condition is significantly worse than Dyatlov's, but he insists that the workers followed the correct procedure. He explains that they pressed the AZ-5 emergency shutdown button and did everything they were supposed to do. Antopsinov confirms Akimov's account and reveals that the reactor's power level felt dangerously low before the test began. This immediately catches Khomyuk's attention, and she starts to suspect that the operators may not have caused the explosion through incompetence alone. While leaving the ward, Khomyuk notices a disturbance involving Lyudmila. The confrontation attracts the attention of the KGB officers monitoring the hospital. Khomyuk's questions about the reactor have already made the authorities suspicious, and she is subsequently arrested. In the back of the Kremlin, Legasov and Sherbina report to Gorbachev. Legasov explains that the accident has created an enormous contamination zone around Chernobyl. Entire forests will need to be destroyed and every domestic and wild animal within the exclusion zone killed. Once the area has been cleared, a huge structure needs to be built around Reactor 4 to contain the radioactive remains. Approximately 750,000 people will be required to complete the operation. The room falls silent as the officials begin to understand the true scale of the disaster on their hands. After the meeting, Legasov asks the KGB chairman to release Khomyuk, explaining that she's working for him and her investigation is vital to understanding the explosion. The chairman eventually agrees, but puts the responsibility on Legasov's shoulders. Legasov visits her in prison and learns what she's discovered. The emergency shutdown should have stopped the reactor, but instead it appears to have triggered the explosion. Khomyuk also explains that the reactor was operating at an extremely low power level before the test. Given a similar incident occurred at the Leningrad nuclear power plant in '75, this suggests that there may be a fundamental flaw with the RBMK reactor. As the surviving firefighters continue deteriorating as the radiation destroys their bodies, Lyudmila refuses to leave him though, and she sits beside Vasily, reminding him of happier memories from their life together. Because their bodies remain dangerously radioactive, when the firefighters pass, they're wrapped in plastic and placed inside zinc coffins. Those coffins are welded shut before being transported to a cemetery and lowered into a mass grave, where concrete is poured over their coffins. Lyudmila and the other grieving relatives watch from behind a barrier. Episode 4 of Chernobyl shifts the focus slightly to look at the harrowing, enormous human cost of containing the disaster. Several months have passed since the explosion, but Reactor 4 is still dangerously radioactive. Hundreds of thousands of people are now being brought into the exclusion zone to clear contaminated land and prevent radioactive material from spreading any further. Elsewhere, a young civilian named Pavel arrives at the exclusion zone to join the liquidators. Like many of the men brought into Chernobyl, he has no idea what his assignment actually involves. Now Pavel is placed alongside a group led by a hardened soldier named Barcho. Their task is to move through the abandoned villages and kill any animals left behind. Now the pets have been exposed to radiation and could spread contamination beyond the exclusion zone if left unchecked. They cannot be allowed to survive regardless of how healthy they appear. Now Barcho hands Pavel a rifle and tells him no animal should suffer. If the first shot does not kill it, he needs to fire again immediately. Pavel is visibly uncomfortable, but there's no way to avoid the work. Meanwhile, Legasov and Sherbina continue overseeing the cleanup operation at the power plant. The bigger problem now stems from the graphite scattered across the roof beside Reactor 4. These pieces were thrown from the core during the explosion and are still intensely radioactive. Before a containment structure can be built around the reactor, the graphite must be pushed back inside. The levels are far too high for workers to remain on the roof, so the Soviet government begins using remotely operated machines instead. Several robots are brought to Chernobyl and tested on less dangerous sections of the building, but the machines, while successfully clearing some of the debris, most remain impossible for the robots to reach. In the end, they have no choice but to bring people in to do the job. Now back in the villages, Pavel follows Barcho and another soldier from house to house. Now Pavel hesitates when he encounters his first dog, and after firing, he fails to kill it cleanly and freezes as the wounded animal cries out. Now Barcho quickly finishes the job and angrily reminds Pavel of his instructions. Whatever they feel about the work, they cannot allow the animals to suffer unnecessarily. The bodies are loaded onto trucks and eventually transported to a large trench where they're buried beneath concrete. The work becomes increasingly difficult for Pavel as they continue through the abandoned area, and at one property Pavel discovers a dog nursing a litter of puppies. He raises his weapon but cannot bring himself to fire, so he waits for Barcho to arrive and do the dirty work instead. At the plant, General Tarakanov gathers the men who will be sent onto the roof. He explains that the radiation is so intense they can only remain outside for approximately 90 seconds. Each man must run to the graphite, shovel as much debris as possible over the edge and return immediately. Any longer could expose them to a potentially fatal dose. Their protection consists of lead plating strapped around their bodies, but that only provides limited shielding. When the signal is given, each liquidator runs onto the roof carrying a shovel. They throw pieces of graphite over the edge before scrambling back towards safety. Supervisors shout the remaining time as the workers desperately try to complete their assignments. Each person spends no more than a minute and a half outside, but even that is enough to expose them to a significant amount of radiation, and more than 3,000 men are eventually used to clear the roof. While the cleanup continues, Khomyuk investigates the events leading up to the explosion. She's discovered that the operators were attempting to complete a safety test that had already been delayed several times. When the reactor's power fell too low, Dyatlov forced the team to continue rather than abandoning the procedure. To raise the power, the workers removed almost all of the control rods from the reactor, leaving it dangerously unstable. Now, the RBMK reactor also had a hidden design flaw. When the AZ-5 emergency shutdown button was pressed, the graphite tips of the control rods briefly increased the reaction instead of reducing it. Under normal conditions, this may not have triggered a disaster, but Reactor 4 at this point was already in an extremely unstable state. The emergency shutdown triggered a massive power surge, causing the reactor to explode. Khomyuk realizes that their operators made serious mistakes, but they did not know about the fatal flaw in the control rods. The Soviet government had concealed previous evidence of the problem. If a design fault remained secret, every other RBMK reactor in the Soviet Union could suffer a similar accident. By December 1986, the roof has finally been cleared and the massive containment structure around Reactor 4 is completed. The officials congratulate themselves on containing the disaster, but it's very clear that the danger is not truly over yet. Legasov is due to appear before the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, where he's tasked with explaining what caused the explosion. The Soviet government expects him to blame the plant operators and reassure the world that the RBMK reactor is safe. However, Khomyuk urges Legasov to reveal the truth about the faulty control rods and the government's decision to conceal the earlier incident at Leningrad. Legasov is reluctant, given telling the truth would destroy his career and place everyone around him in danger. The episode ends with Legasov facing an impossible decision. In March 1987, Legasov has returned from Vienna, where he presents the official Soviet explanation for the explosion. His testimony blames the plant operators and reassures the international community that the RBMK reactor is safe. The government considers his appearance a success and hints that he may soon be promoted. However, Legasov knows that the reactor's design flaw still has not been fixed. Khomyuk visits and urges him to reveal the truth during the upcoming trial of Anatoly, Dyatlov, Brukhanov, and Fomin. The trial begins in the town of Chernobyl, with Dyatlov, Brukhanov, and Fomin seated together as defendants. Sherbina speaks first, describing the immediate response to the explosion and the enormous operation required to contain it. Sherbina makes it clear that the disaster did not end when the fire was extinguished, given its consequences will continue for decades. Khomyuk then takes the stand to explain the events leading up to the explosion. You see, on April 25, 1986, the workers at Reactor 4 prepared to conduct a safety test. The aim here was to determine whether the slowing turbine could briefly power the plant's water pumps during an electrical failure. The reactor's power was supposed to be reduced during the day, but the electrical grid controller ordered the plant to delay the test. Reactor 4 was then left operating at half power for several hours. By the time permission arrived to continue, the day shift had gone home and the evening workers were preparing to leave. The test was therefore left to the night shift, and a lot of them weren't properly briefed about this. While reducing the reactor's output, 25-year-old operator Leonid Toptunov accidentally caused the power to fall almost completely. The test should have been abandoned, but instead Dyatlov ordered the workers to restore the power and continue on. The computer recommended shutting it down, but Dyatlov ignored their concerns. He threatened the workers with dismissal and demanded that they proceed as normal. To raise the power, Toptunov removed almost all of the control rods from the core. The number left inside fell away below the minimum safety requirement, leaving the reactor dangerously unstable. Dyatlov denies responsibility and claims that he wasn't present, but Khomyuk presents records and witness statements showing otherwise. He was very much in the control room and repeatedly pressured the operators. During a short recess, Sherbina begins coughing and he steps outside with Legasov. Sherbina admits that before Chernobyl, he considered himself insignificant. He spent his career carrying out orders and managing bureaucracy, but his involvement in the disaster has allowed him to accomplish something meaningful. Legasov reassures him that his leadership has actually helped save countless lives. Sherbina returns a sentiment, acknowledging that Legasov's knowledge and persistence prevented the catastrophe from becoming even worse. It's a really compelling moment and a lovely way of progressing both characters, given they began this series butting heads in that helicopter, but since then have become close allies. And when the trial resumes, Legasov takes the stand to explain the final moments before the explosion. The safety test begins shortly after 1:23 AM. As the workers cut power to the turbine, the water pumps began slowing down, and with less water entering the core, more of it turned into steam. This is particularly dangerous inside an RBMK reactor, where increased steam creates more power. More power produces more steam, which in turn produces more power, and yeah, you get the picture. It creates a rapidly accelerating cycle. Ordinarily, the control rods would slow the reaction, but given most of them were removed, that didn't happen. The remaining safety systems had also been disconnected to prevent them from interrupting the test. When the power begins rising rapidly, Akimov presses the AZ-5 emergency shutdown button. This should have inserted every control rod into the reactor and stopped the nuclear reaction, but instead it triggered an explosion. The control rods were actually tipped with graphite, so when they first entered the reactor, these tips briefly increase the reaction before the rod's boron sections begin reducing it. Under normal conditions, this wouldn't have been an issue, but reactor 4 was already extremely unstable. The reactor rose to several times its maximum output, rupturing the fuel channels and jamming the control rods. 2 explosions then tore through the building and exposed the core. Dyatlov interrupts and accuses Legasov of lying, but it was Dyatlov's reckless decisions that created the conditions for the disaster. The reactor exploded because of a design flaw hidden by the Soviet state. A similar problem had been discovered following an earlier accident at the Leningrad nuclear plant. Rather than correcting the fault, the authorities simply buried the report. After the trial, Legasov is taken into a private room by KGB chairman Charkov. Charkov tells him that his testimony will be suppressed and the official record will place responsibility on those that stand trial, while Legasov's claims about the reactor will simply disappear. As predicted, Legasov also loses his influence, position and access to the scientific community. He's also no longer able to attend conferences or speak freely with his colleagues. The series then returned to Legasov's apartment in 1988. Before taking his own life, he records the truth onto a collection of tapes and hides them where they can eventually be discovered. And at the end of the show, we get a montage explaining what happened to everyone after the credits roll. Dyatlov, Brukhanov and Fomin were sentenced to 10 years of hard labour. Sherbina died in 1990, while Legasov's tapes eventually circulated through the Soviet scientific community. His suicide helped force the truth about the RBMK reactor into the open, and the remaining reactors were later modified. Ulana Khomyuk is revealed to be a fictional composite representing the scientists who investigated the disaster and risked their careers to uncover the truth. Lyudmila survived and later gave birth to a son, while the 3 men who drained the water beneath the reactor also lived, despite many reports claiming they died shortly afterwards. The hundreds of thousands of liquidators participated in the cleanup, although the final number of deaths caused by radiation remains disputed to this day. The truth was eventually revealed, but only after countless people had already paid the price for it. Chernobyl ends by returning to the central question raised at the beginning of the series. What is the cost of lies? Thanks for watching, and do let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Smash a like or subscribe to the channel, your support is very much appreciated. I'm Greg Wheeler, and from all of us over here at The Review Geek, we'll see you on the next video.